Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is Ryan Christian of The Last American Vagabond. He previously came on that kind of world there with kind of the digital reality we're going into. But today we're going to do something a little bit different, kind of talk about Ryan's background, kind of his journey and how he got to this space, some of the topics that was, and I guess how many topics, he's covered over the years that seem to be coming to fruition in reality. As a listener of Ryan and others like him, you generally see them talking about certain topics. So it's great to kind of actually learn a bit more about the person. So thanks for coming on, Ryan. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me on, and my pleasure to be here. I sound like I'm getting a little feedback. Should I put some headphones in?
Thank you. It's all right. Normally, once I start talking, stop talking, I put myself on mute. It's probably just coming out from my side, so we'll see how it goes. But just for people who don't know you, just just tell them a brief little bit about yourself and the Last American Vagabond.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I just want to say right out of the gate, I love the name of your show, The Truth Over Comfort. It's really where we need to be right now, and that's why I talk about like irritatingly being objective. And, it's like we need to like overshoot in that direction. And we really need to stop allowing our, feelings and comfort to supersede what, the truth is. So I like that. But, really, and it's such a large thing to encapsulate in kind of an opening thing, like you're saying, we really can have a whole conversation about it today. But this all started for me completely it was not planned. I didn't have this design to do this and become a media platform. I was at the time I was not really backpacking, but traveling with my friend. I just don't consider backpacking being inside the United States. So it's like we were traveling inside the United States, and I was in my RV, and he and I were kind of just in between. I am a classically trained chef. I went to the Culinary Institute of America in Napa Valley. And that's what I did before this. I managed very high-end restaurants, worked at a lot of some of the best places in the world when I was in Napa Valley, and, both a chef, sous chef, executive chef, general manager, kind of like that's what I was doing for a long time. And I love it. I love the cooking side of it. Only really got into general manager side because of the money, but I love the food side of it. It's the passion, artistic side of it. And it's something I really still love and care about. And I never had plans to leave it. And I was traveling with my friend because I just wanted something new. I was done with the place I was working with. And the best thing about being a chef or a cook even is that you can find work anywhere. You're never really worried about finding a job for the most part, if you're good at it anyway. And so we would, I just decided we were going to make a move, and we got my RV and we started traveling. Now, all that being said, because, I wasn't like in this mindset. I was out looking for jobs like as a sous chef, as a kitchen, but still kind of wanted something different, but didn't know yet really what that meant for me. And my buddy started a website, a blog really about sports. And I just, that was really the beginning. I just said, that's cool. Like I want to do something like that. And, and kind of another side story to it, which I've also talked about, is at that time I was really kind of just confounded by my own kind of little awakening, where I'm going like, how is it possible that I can see two stories being discussed and both of them are telling you Fox, CNN, that this is the fact, and they're contradicting each other. I'm like, am I the only one noticing this? Like, it's like, well, clearly, like, it's the weird dynamic in the two-party illusion is like, well, that side lies all the time. It's like such a selective choice. Anyway, so I was like, I want to talk about what I see in that. And cannabis was a big part of my life, not just because I smoke cannabis and weed and do edibles and whatever else like I always have, but because I saw through the illusion of what they were doing from the government side of it. The cannabis, like a great book is The Emperor Wears No Clothes. I recommend that. But so then I that's what I kind of decided to start it as. The blog was just I think the name, The Last American Vagabond, as you mentioned briefly off air, I was reading a book called Vagabonding. I was really into the idea of travel and really the idea of traveling on the cheap, not just on the cheap, but like minimalist travel, like really, a tiny bag, just what you need, staying in hostels, eating street food, like that kind of stuff. And I'm really very passionate about it. And that's one of the places where that kind of came from. And so that name really just popped out of nowhere. Like that, it was like, I forget where the last part of it came from, but it was kind of like I was talking about the travel, and I just like Last American Vagabond, and it never even faltered. From that point forward, that's what it was. And it's interesting, those moments like that stand out for me. where it's like that was, what whatever the word might be, godsend or serendipitous, whatever it is, it just kind of jumped into my mind, and it's clearly what it was meant to be. And the name for me is always kind of represented, the Last American Vagabond, a vagabond in there's a lot of different varying definitions. People love to throw the dirty traveler. It really just means an aimless traveler you don't really have a destination. You're just traveling for any number of reasons. And so it, for me, became, and in a little bit in the beginning, but really became the idea of never ending pursuit for truth, right? That you're always in a traveling sense. You're always trying to find the next thing. It's never settled. It's always more information. You just understand it as it is. And so from there, it just evolved rapidly. It started with a very cannabis focus, a lot about cannabis law reform, and again, how that really broadens out into just government lying and false flags, conspiracy, we're told, things that a lot of people are coming aggressively, in a very disjointed way aware of, that they've never thought of before. And all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, these things have been real and they always have been. And my whole worldview's a lie. That's kind of what a lot of people are dealing with right now. But so the cannabis thing was a lot of it for a long time. And then eventually, I forget what the reasoning was behind it or what kind of motivated me to. I had a couple of people I was working with at the time that were really interested in other topics as well. And so it kind of broadened me out. And long story short, from there, it just kind of became, anything you're being lied to about. And brought on some amazing people, from Derek Bros to Whitney Webb, Taylor Hudak, Robert Inlakesh, Matt Arrett, right now Jason Bassler from the Free Thought Project, which is an amazing platform that has been diminished over the years because of censorship, is now working with us to do memes and little clips and so on. And so just really proud of what we put together. Never thought it would be what it is today. And I'm proud that it's become that.
Yeah, no, I think we spoke about obviously your name before, vagabond. Obviously, I think coming from the word vagrant, which was kind of a person a few centuries ago who didn't have a home, who would kind of roam and often get kicked out of towns and places like that because they didn't have a home. But no, I think that's a real kind of cool story. Obviously, going from traveling, I always find it.
Can I add one thing real quick, just on that point you just said? I just kind of connected this for myself too on why the transition, because you're right. Like classically, the word comes from something that is, like a homeless person, But what I think that what changed the understanding, or rather, just as words evolve, is the time frame around sort of like the Jack Kerouac kind of like the idea that it was almost, it wasn't because you're destitute. It was a choice to be able to aimlessly travel. The classic quote is, not all who wander are lost. And I believe that was Henry David Thoreau. I think I forget where that comes from, but also Henry David Thoreau, and like all these different kind of ideas about how to look at the world in a different way. I think that's what kind of flavored that understanding of it, at least for me. So please continue. I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick one on where my name came from, truth over comfort. I mean, that's not an invention by me. It was, I think it was a quote, and it was, people prefer a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth, basically. And I remember, because I first started where I made a website, and it was basically just kind of quotes where I'd read books, and then I'd put the quote, the link, hyperlink it, just for myself. And I basically got annoyed with when I looked up quotes from books and go to these quote websites, and they would have no source, no link. It was just like a picture of David Rockefeller or something, like, yeah, he said this. And instead of kind of just being annoyed about it, I thought, well, I'm just going to make my own kind of quote website. And then I remember like doing my little about me page or whatever, and then I realized the one quote, about the uncomfortable truth, or, comfortable lie. I was like, where did that quote come from? I was like, am I going to have a whole website about quotes with all these links? And I can't track that, but I eventually did find it. I can't remember who it was, but yeah, that's kind of where the name comes from there. But you obviously mentioned that the weed, cannabis, the war on drugs was one of the first things that set you off. That was similar to me. The war on drugs was one of the first things where I kind of started looking. Didn't make any sense, especially being in England and America, how alcohol was treated in our culture as part of every funeral, every wedding, every celebration, every christening, every whatever it is, alcohol is involved, and that's perfectly fine. But the war on drugs wasn't, and kind of learning about, weed not being as harmful as they said, and then onto other things like that. So, what was it for you was it just kind of weed, or the kind of general kind of war on drugs that started getting you, I guess, writing blogs with kind of your friend who had about sport or whatever?
Well, I think the journey for that, the Canada side of it, I mean, I think I was always raised to question authority in a positive way, whatever that might mean to somebody. Like, that from a, like my father's a teacher, and he's, in my opinion, the only kind of good teacher that there is, and is somebody who is willing to teach you about what, even if it's classically held beliefs, even if it's super sensitive topics about historical events, the point being, like, this is what we're taught, but what do you think about it? What do feel free to question these things. Feel free to challenge ideas. That's what teachers should do, And so for me, I've always been a little bit of a contrarian, just because it's like, and in the real sense, actually, like as a kid, I mean, because right now I get people called me that. I think I'm just somebody who challenges, what authority says in places where I feel like it's unjust, a contrarian, someone who just finds the need to be contrary to anything that's popular, and I think as a kid, I don't think that's what I do today. As a kid, though, I definitely think there was a period of, just where I bucked the system in my mind, where it's like, I don't, you have to listen to you, or, whatever else, in a bad way, like over the top, but I think it was a positive growth process for me to realize that, just because you're in a position of authority doesn't mean that you're right. It doesn't mean that I even should or have to listen to you. Like, that's just this weird dynamic. In some cases, I would argue, yes, that does mean that, a child and a parent and whatever else. But this static understanding we have that it's just, if they're in power, you should listen. And so that kind of flavored my perspective growing up. And then, as I got into the high school age, and somebody introduced me to smoking marijuana. And, for me, it was like, well, I've been told this is like the worst thing ever, and that you're all going to die, and you do it once and you're never the same, all these stupid lies that they jam down your throat. And I'm like, well, I don't believe any of that. I mean, I saw things that I already knew in it. I'm trying to remember what the examples were. Canada's being one of them after this, where I realized that they were lying, like I think actually it was alcohol. I think I remember, like, my freshman year, we ended up doing something, like we ended up drinking after some party, and it was new to me at the time. And I was like, this is fucking fun. See, I don't know if we can cuss or not. This is, I had a great time, and I'm like, okay, well, even at that age, I'm mature enough to be able to acknowledge that I shouldn't just go drink every 30 seconds the rest of my life. And clearly there's downsides to it, but I'm alive. That was a lot of fun. Like, the way that it was framed as to us was like, you ruin your life and it's over. And I just, so at that point, I'm like, okay, well, there's some truth in between this. It's not the crazy story they're giving. It's not, and so that same kind of mindset with cannabis was that, I was already resistant to what they're putting forward. And for me, it was a little bit of a, it opened my eyes to a lot of things. The way that it made you see the world, the conversations you had, the way that, whatever it is. The novelty wears away like anything else, but eventually you realize that there are definite positives that people in history have talked about. People from singers like Bob Marley, or academics who have spoken about the actual scientific positive nature of what these things are. And that's something I recently just spoke about again on Substack, on the T-Lab Substack. And that is what opened my research into, what about the textiles? What about the medicine from, hemp style things? And this is where, cannabis is a broad term, implies not just marijuana. As you know, it's hemp and different aspects of the different variations. And so from hemp's perspective, within the field of cannabis, you can literally change the world from better, longer lasting products to better, longer, and actually working medicines with no side effects. This kind of stuff gets roundly dismissed by people in the mainstream sphere, but it's provable documentation. There's peer-reviewed science on this stuff. So, so that blew me away. Like, I already knew different things, but that opened this door for me. Like, wow, okay, wait a minute. This is not just some like business trying to downplay something. This is from a government level, from a century, like, today kind of concept, but, decades and decades and decades of nonstop provable lies that people in the community around them, who are supposed to be the ones going, that's incorrect, media, scientific, academic communities, just let it go. And, there's the occasional one that speak up and say that's not true, and they get cast out, and every step you take, you're seeing these things. If you have an open mind to see things that don't align with what you're told you're supposed to look at. You see what I'm saying? Like, so already having that contrarian perspective, you'd go in and see these things where this person got kicked out, and you read their story and it's like, oh, but he was here's why, the mainstream story, because he's a bad person, whatever. And you're like, well, I think it's because he said the thing you guys don't like. And, and so all that became this gigantic opening window for me that realized that cannabis was like the starting point for how everything else is dealt with. how the government will completely lie to you about literally anything that they think is important. And everybody around them bolsters this lie because they're either told it's for their patriotic duty or because, you know, you can go on forever. And this today, you know, we're covering literally anything you could talk about, from foreign policy to transgender. You know, it's like just everything, because we're being lied to about so much. But thank God people are starting to see through it.
Yeah, I think that just on the contrarian thing, I think if something, you know, someone like you, the work you do, is almost kind of an insult being called that, because it's basically like you're just being controversial and going against it just for the sake of it, rather than picking certain subjects, you know, as you said. But
And letting facts guide you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with the war on drugs, I think it's just for me personally, one of the most frustrating subjects on the planet. It doesn't have to be from a perspective of you want to do drugs for your personal freedom. You know, there's people who don't do drugs who can still be for legalization. I mean, it's more the war on drugs. You can't see it through the lens of there's just these bunch of kind of hippie people who want to legalize weed and all these psychedelics or whatever drugs because they're just big druggies and they want to do it. You got to look at it, the bigger picture of, you know, one, the black market, the impurity of the actual drugs. You know, you hear it all the time. Someone overdosed or died from something, but it wasn't the drug. You know, it wasn't ecstasy. It was what was in it. So it's about, one, making it safer, regulated like it is for alcohol. Then you have taking the money out of the gangs. You know, people like Pablo Escobar, the mafia, whoever. All these people who gain all their money from the drugs, and then they can, you know, buy guns or traffic people, wherever. Normally, the bulk of the money will come from the drugs. So you take that out of it. And obviously, there's just so many factors, and I just find it hard. People just don't see that. They just see it as you just want to do drugs, rather than, you know, it's like, have you ever seen that South Park episode where, I'm not sure if you ever watched South Park much, but, you know, these people come into the schools and they tell them don't smoke and all this stuff, and then straight away all the kids go out and start smoking. It's like the way they do drug education is kind of like the Reagan "Just Say No" campaign. They go, you know, just don't do it because it's dangerous. They do it for alcohol as well. And they say, you know, it does this to your liver, it does all this, it's dangerous. Just don't do it. But then it's like, well, what's the plan if you do it? You know, how do you do it safely? You know, when you're doing this drug, you should never do more than this, or you should do these things. Like, you know, a parent would say to their child the first time they drink, obviously in America, the drinking age is 21. In the UK, it's 18, but like, you know, most parents are pretty fine you drinking from 13, 14 years upwards with your friends, and they go, you know, make sure you don't drink on an empty stomach, make sure you drink some water, make sure you don't drink just spirits, like all this stuff. They actually say this is how you do it safely if you're going to do it. But when it's drugs, it's just like, no, just don't do it. What's the plan kind of afterwards? So when you're talking about there, and, you know, obviously cannabis was the first thing that kind of got you onto that. So how did that then stem into other subjects? What was kind of the next one after that got you? Because, you know, there's plenty of people who have views about the war on drugs, but it kind of stops there. They may not think about other things. So what was kind of the next topic that, you know, took you to kind of the next space, I guess?
Well, I think it's actually the war on drugs in general. I mean, it's the next logical step to stay, because it's, you know, it's not just the focus on cannabis, right? It's the focus on really broadening out into the constitutional discussion about whether they have the right to tell you what you're allowed to put in your body or not. And it's all these gradual steps like that. You know, the first thing just going like, okay, well, like if you feel cannabis isn't bad and they're telling you it's the most deadly drug in the world, which, by the way, is still this ridiculous. This is the game that we're talking about in the beginning. The cannabis can still be listed as a Schedule I drug, as wildly addictive, no medical value. That's what it means. And yet cocaine is Schedule II. I mean, we always laugh about how effing stupid that is, right? And so they still maintain it there. You know, so if people like that can realize, well, that's really dumb, and it makes you question, okay, well, what about these other drugs? Which is actually interesting because it actually creates, if somebody's, you know, has brain cells and smart enough, they can go, well, that's a contradiction of logic right there. Maybe heroin's not that bad, and I don't think that. My point is you can open the door for people to see that you're lying about a benign substance, so they're going to go, well, what about these other very dangerous things I should, you know? And so the problem is that as a child, I think it's obviously a parent's realm to be able to, you know, to be telling your children what they can and can't do in any sense, not the government, right? And I think that the war on drugs kind of opened that door for me to realize that this was bigger than just the cannabis thing. This was about the regulation of our bodies and what we can put in our bodies under a guise of keeping us safe. When clearly, to your other point, you can prove the U.S. government is actively involved with drug trafficking from all over the world, right? From working with drug capitals of the world like Colombia while pretending Venezuela is a drug narco capital of the world. Like, Colombia is one of the largest cocaine outputs in the world, and the U.S. is an ally with them, so they don't care. But they point at Venezuela for being some drug trafficker. It's like it's such a contradiction all over the place, And so I think that it shows you that obviously they don't care about your safety, and so that opened this conversation for me to really wherever the next logical step is. Is this about something bigger? Why would they want to control what goes in your body? Is it because they're making money off this? Is it because they're trying to actually drive you to the black market? There's all these different ways you can look at it. And anytime, if you're stepping that far into a conversation, it opens up to just literally everything. I mean, because at this point you're talking about war on drugs. Well, just cannabis, right? Which then goes to the war on drugs, which then goes to the U.S. government's management of it, which then goes to the involvement of them in trafficking, which then becomes foreign policy, right? So now you're talking about foreign countries and how are they involved with that country and what are they doing to make sure that government doesn't care? And so that's a very rapid point, but this is the evolution over a decade of like deep research and realizing one after another. You get to this moment where I was, which I still find myself in frequently, but there was a moment where it kind of was at its apex where I was, or I guess, its peak, where I was like, what isn't fake? Like what, like sitting back going, like watching a new James Corbett thing about like, I think I remember that thought when I watched his point about, it was a long time ago on like the, one of the shooters. Which one was it? I mean, any number of them, for crying out loud. Like just any of the bombings or like the, the World Trade Center bombing, the first one, any number of these things. And you go like, I've heard this story before. I've never researched it in depth. This is a long time ago. And you read through it and you're going like, oh my God, it's, it's an MK Ultra connection. Oh my God, it's this guy. It's like, just everything we know has been flavored and altered with those kind of lies. And, I guess all that being said, it's really just about realizing that your government is not in this for you. You know what I mean? Like the whole the premise of what they're doing, like the whole basis is about keeping you pacified so they can maintain their agendas. And some people pretend that's because their agenda is in your best interest. That's quite a self-serving assumption. The reality of our history proves that's not true. But that's really where it all comes back to. And it's an uncomfortable thing to realize, right? I mean, it's scary, but it's like truth over comfort, 100%.
Yeah, just a few points on that. I mean, as you made a good point, the war on drugs opens up to so many subjects. So you could talk about Iran-Contra, where obviously during the Iran-Iraq war, we were supplying Iraq, Saddam Hussein, but also we were selling arms to Iran through Israel, and then using that money to fund the war in Nicaragua with the Contras, Ronald Reagan kind of times, and then obviously reports of people like Barry Seal and others. The CIA being involved in shipping cocaine from there to Miami, and then Rick Ross and the crack story there. And then you've also got, the private prison system. I mean, again, I'm jumping between the US and the UK, but with the US here, the private prison system is a lot bigger than the UK. It still exists here, but the US is on a billion scale rather than a million. All the money they make in the private prison system, and then how they use people for cheap labor there and everything around that. And again, with the private prisons and prison system, they can't even keep the drugs out of there. And then
they don't want to.
Yeah. And then you can talk through, the war on drugs. And then, like you said, you have MK Ultra, where the CIA used LSD on people where they didn't know, did all these experiments. So there's just so much that kind of comes from it. Another point you mentioned, again, so in the UK, we have classes instead of schedules. So for us, heroin, meth, cocaine is actually class A, which is the highest one. Weed is class B, used to be class C. But in America, as you said, weed is schedule 1, but methamphetamine is schedule 2. And the reason for that is because the schedules are based off, can it be, medically used? So it's kind of the top schedule has no medical use, physically harmful, highly addictive. That's kind of normally what it is across the UK and the US. So meth is in schedule 2 because it has a medical name, desoxin. And you can look this up I'll put it up on the screen. Not sure if you know this yourself, Ryan, but I'll put it in the show notes. You can see it on the FDA, you can see it on the DEA. But basically, they give kids from the age of 6 or above, for ADD, they will prescribe desoxin for ADD. So, you get Ritalin, which is kind of like, speed, and amphetamine that they give people with ADHD. But they give desoxin, I don't know how commonly, but they prescribe it to kids with ADD, and you can read the FDA thing, and it says from the age of 6 or above. And I remember I had Scott Horton on. He was kind of talking about the war on drugs, and I was like, imagine you take your 6-7-year-old kid to the doctors. You're like, yeah, he's a bit energetic, can't really concentrate, a bit impulsive, ADHD kind of symptoms. They're like, we've got just the thing for you. It's meth. They're like, did you hear that, honey? Oh, that funny joke the doctor made. No, it's meth. But don't worry, it's just called desoxin, and it's fine. It's FDA approved, Schedule 2. So, that sums up the war on drugs right there. The aspect of meth is a lower schedule than weed, and that the whole prescription, big pharma side of it, that, yeah, you can give your child who's 6 or above meth because he has ADD, or actually as well for weight loss for people with diabetes. Not sure if you knew that or not, but I just thought I'd add that.
No, that's wild, man. I mean, it's just, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's such a complete, I mean, it's the same point is made about cannabis, that they are putting people in prison in like the 90s, and they had a medical patent for it. That was a secret at the time, and now people know about it. But it's like, so you're literally keeping in a schedule that says no medical value while you have a medical patent, while giving it to people for medical value. That was also happening. Like, it was, trials. It's just so ridiculous. But yeah, the meth thing, that's pretty crazy. And it just shows you that it's about making their profit both ways. You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, and then even better is to stand back and look at the illusion of any, like, again, even the Schedule 1 from the U.S. side of it for Schedule 2, or just the idea that they demonize cannabis more than literally anything else. And look at the problems that, like, meth, everybody knows what these meth groupings look like. With these, like, just one, I actually compare it to what actual alcoholism looks like too. We just don't associate it with that. Alcoholism is one of the worst. Alcohol is like one of the worst things to put in your body, even compared to meth. Actually, scientifically, that's a true. I've seen studies about that. But that meth, it's like this visual, like teeth with sucked in face, like it's horrible. Can you see any cannabis communities that look like that? Like, these stories they throw at you about what cannabis did, or that cannabis leads to meth. And it's like all these lies. I've been debunking these since I started doing this. The gateway theory is one of the classic lies that you can prove are just completely arbitrary. I mean, it's so frustrating. I mean, I can go off on that forever. But yeah, that meth point, make sure you send me that. I'd love to talk about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, I'll send you it. I mean, I first heard it myself. I was watching Joe Rogan with Hamilton Morris, the one who does the TV show, Hamilton's I can't remember the Pharmapedia, so something like that. And he's talking, he's really good. He's does drugs himself, but he also knows all the science behind it. Does all the studies, everything. Really, really intelligent guy. And he mentioned it about desoxin, and I couldn't believe it. So I looked it up, and I'll put it up on the screen. I'll send it to you. On the FDA. You can see, their whole kind of report about it, why that is. And then again, with kind of the scare stories behind drugs, so it's like, if you do heroin once, or wherever it is, you're just hooked forever, and there's just this demon that takes over you and you have no control. But then in hospitals they use morphine and diamorphine and loads of different opioids. Morphine is just like a couple molecules away from heroin. Diamorphine is heroin. There's plenty of people who obviously got hooked on OxyContin and things, but there's plenty of people who go into the hospital and get morphine because they broke their leg or whatever, and they're just fine. So how do you explain that? One person gets addicted to it, one doesn't. It's normally, again, I think a lot of people see it more from the chemical addiction side, but normally people who are drug addicts are just unhappy people, and it's a symptom of the greater kind of problems in their life, and obviously creates more problems. But I mean, before we kind of get back onto kind of your journey, just out of interest, what do you think the kind of number one reason is that the war on drugs is still going and they still want it illegal? Because it's not just just America doing this. I mean, it all kind of comes from Harry Anslinger, the early 1920s. Obviously, you had Prohibition, that ends, alcohol's legal, and all these people kind of still need jobs. And then you have Nixon, who declares the war on drugs, but obviously it started before that, and you got Reagan, but it spread around the whole world. There's plenty of countries who legalized weed. Portugal, Czech Republic, decriminalized drugs. But, why is it that the war on drugs is still going? Because one, there is a lot of money to be made in legalization and taxes. And, corporations are going to end up probably the ones making the money rather than, just normal people. So obviously there's the counter of other money that can be made elsewhere. So what is the reason you have they want it illegal? There's obviously lots of different interests. So what's your kind of view on why, they're still pushed to have drugs illegal?
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting point because there's a lot of dynamics to it, and I think it's what you pretty much said right there is, yeah, sure, they could just decide to shift into illegal, which I argue is the clear plan if and when they're just driven with pitchforks and torches to make it happen by the people. That okay, fine, we'll make it legal. But right now they're building the infrastructure to maximize their profit at your expense by doing that. They tried with Marinol and they hurt people with the little pill they made, and so now they're just going back to just the tax part of it, and they're still doing that. But I think the point would be made that that's because that is money that you all are aware of. That's the difference, right? The black market, they can do whatever they want. And let's not pretend like they're not completely immersed in the black market when it comes to all of this stuff. I mean, it's not a coincidence that they occupy Afghanistan, where the opium fields had been utterly destroyed down to basically nothing, and then remove the Taliban from that control. Poppies explode, and 90% of it comes back. And all of a sudden, opioid crisis, opium, poppy, heroin and opioids coming from this field explode around the world. And then, weirdly enough, jump forward to when they leave Afghanistan. The moment they stop, hey, we're at a shortage of opioids for all. They literally put that story out. It's like people who don't want to see it choose not to see it. It's obvious what they were doing. They were occupying the poppy fields in one aspect of this. They were taking lithium from the mountains and all sorts of stuff. But that's what this is really about. So it's obviously about using the black market in one aspect of it to be able to not only wildly profit on the backs of the very things you claim you're trying to stop, robbing, stealing, whatever else you want to do, taking these things from the people they claim they're stealing them from, or stopping them from doing, selling, or using the black market in of itself and the use of the network to be able to facilitate all sorts of other black market, dark, dangerous things like human trafficking, and these are things that our governments are involved in, and we need to realize that. This is stuff that's been called out from the level of the UN. There was a presentation in front of The Hague in regard to this happening during the Syrian war about the U.S. government and those involved. It's like just because Americans refuse, and largely Britons as well, to see these things, the world is very aware of the reality of our governments, and so that, I think, is the large part about it. One of the obvious points to make is that they just don't want to admit that no matter how they end it, it'll be admitting they were wrong, right? That's what that ultimately is. That's why they kicked the can down the road for Vietnam, knowing after a few years they were never going to win, but yet dragged it out, letting people die because no president wanted to be, seen for the one that ended it. But that was only one. There's a lot of other parts. Actually, what we're talking about is a part of it too. What they were doing in the country and so on. Same thing with Afghanistan. They dragged it out, and so that's probably one of the most obvious when it comes to like the inner dynamic of like who's in shifting presidencies. And, nobody wants to be the one to be like, yep, we failed. Let's end it right now, or pull out of any country because that means we're failing. It's like they're so insecure about their image around the world. And really they should be, because we're all seeing through them today. But I'm trying to think of any other ways that stand out in why they want to keep it going. But I think that's the real obvious one. I wanted to add to what you said first, actually, about addiction, which I think is a really valid point. We don't think enough about what it really is. We lean into these classic things we're told about, you touch once and you're addicted forever, and like these concepts, like you said, chemical addiction, which there is a level of this, but it's broadly misunderstood. We need to understand that you can be addicted to literally anything. You can be addicted to jogging. You can be addicted to junk food. And I mean like literally addicted to these things, to where you have a chemical process that you crave. And obviously there are chemical processes involved with things like heroin. They're far, far, far more demanding with withdrawals and so on. But my point is that, and I'll point to Gabriel Mate, who's actually the father of Aaron Mate, who is outstanding in his research around addiction. Like one of the ones I think almost leading the charge, it has been in the past, about how we don't understand addiction, but that it's important to see that it's really about, as you said, a choice and a personal life and where you're at in your life and these different dynamics that drive you to make choices that you become dependent on, and then yes, the chemical dependence will build over time, but it's all, I think that's an interesting point. But back to the war on drugs aspect, I definitely think that it's artificially maintained. And I think it's at the expense of literally everybody. Why that then jumped to all the rest of the other countries? That's the last. I'll leave it at that. Is I think and you call me a pessimist. I'm jaded. I don't believe governments are on our side. My gut instinct would be because they recognize the same thing the U.S. government does. Oh, well, we can do the same things. We can profit off our seizing of the drugs. We can then sell them to other countries. We can, it's a whole black market behind the scenes. And then I would say that's probably why some of these governments that didn't do that, maybe it's an indication that they're not as corrupt as some of the others. Just a thought.
We just carry on. Yeah, so you was kind of just talking about there. I'm not sure if it lagged out for the audience or if it was myself, but you mentioned about obviously the incentives of the drug war for the government involvement, like in Afghanistan, whether it was direct or indirect. The year 2000, the Taliban had the opium right down, and then you can see the chart. The invasion happens, it goes up and up and up. Now it's gone back down again. You can make the argument, was they directly involved, or was it, when you go to war, the worst of the worst kind of get involved and they have their militias, so there's more chaos? I'm not sure.
Well, I can speak to that.
Obviously, yeah.
Well, I can speak to that.
So,
that's an important point, actually, because you're right. It's important to make sure that we know we can prove we have plenty of documentation of U.S. Marines and military personnel literally guarding poppy fields. So like actually on the ground, but also the fact that the Taliban, who is the force that was before they were there ultimately in control, and then after they left, even, basically handed back control, which is so hilarious and disgusting when you realize that they were the argument for why they needed to invade. Now they're like just high-fiving on the way out. It's crazy. But they were the reason that it had been almost diminished. They didn't from a religious perspective, they didn't believe in, the use of it. Essentially, it's a bigger story, bigger discussion there to be had. But then when they left, they brought it right back down. Right. So it's like you can see that the elements in control, like I guess the argument can be made that some other elements slipped in and did it, but then you have to argue that was because the U.S. allowed it. Either way you look at it, And then another thought I had actually on at the occupation side of it too, that justification for maybe not like military occupation, but like taking action from like an international body, like the same thing I've said about Venezuela, literally working with the largest cocaine exporter in the world in Colombia while pretending Venezuela is exporting cocaine and we have to go after them, which builds the narrative around. So as long as you project the idea that you're fighting the bad drug dealers, it's sort of like the idea that they pretend that we're fighting the illegal arms dealers and how Iran's sending arms. And it's like, except you guys literally sell arms to effing anybody who will buy from, like literally there's reports that come out showing they'll sell to the most dangerous, most despotic locations in the world, and so they're weapons manufacturers, it's just they're the weapons, the merchants of death, as you call them. They do the same thing. We just call it something else. So I think that's another part of it, is being able to manufacture support for why other countries you label as drug producers are bad just because you name them bad for doing it.
You can swear on the show, by the way. That's all good. But just what you said there again about Afghanistan, we do know obviously they was guarding the poppies, but that was openly kind of reported, and they said they was kind of protecting the farmers and their livelihoods. But Karl, who was the first president of Afghanistan? Karzai, I can't remember his name, but his half brother was reported as being heavily involved in the opium trade and being, one of the biggest kind of dealers in the country. And that also reported by, I think it was by the Washington Post, that he was on the CIA payroll. He ended up dead, eventually a few years later. But there's whether they was kind of, actually involved shipping it over back to the US, or as you said, they're complicit by. They're the ones who are occupying the country. They know what's going on. They have the intelligence. They have the satellite images. They have all of that. They knew it was going on. So they was happy for that to happen the whole time they was there. And again, what you said, yeah, the US obviously is the biggest arms dealer in the world. To be the biggest arms dealer in the world, you have to basically sell to anyone. Yeah, as you said, there's plenty of reports where they say, here's, the biggest human rights abusers countries and all the countries with dictatorships. And then here's who the US sells to, and it's just that perfect pattern over each other. Right. But just going back to kind of, again, on your journey. So we talked about, obviously, the war on drugs. That goes into foreign policy. Was foreign policy kind of your next step, or was it kind of 9/11 or other kind of subjects? And did it go, because as war on drugs goes really hand in hand with foreign policy. So where was kind of your next step after the war on drugs, would you say?
I think, I think it clearly became foreign policy, focuses on, really the Israel conversation, Israel, Palestine, a lot of these different dynamics. I think just because I care about, at a core point of all of this, people who are being oppressed, people who aren't being given a voice, right? And I mean, that overlaps with the cannabis conversation as well, because of what was done in that whole suppression of, and I'm not talking about going after people smoking weed. I'm talking about like the actual suppression of the industry and the people involved, and, being called what they aren't. And so, yeah, I think it just generally became a lot of foreign policy, and really just anything. People sending me things going, like seeing me as some like new budding person who's like looking at things and talking about them, like dumping things in my lap. Well, check this out. Make sure you don't miss this. Look what happened in Syria, And so that became clearly, if you look at my track record, where I leaned into next. But I don't know if that was like the next choice. I think really at that time for me, it was already in the mindset for me. It was everything, like the fact that this one thing blossoms into just about every topic you can look into, so many different things, even going the other direction, going inward, going domestic and pharmaceuticals, and what they did with this stuff and what they're doing around it and what they're trying, it's like, it's crazy. Right. And so I think that there's obviously a big pharma part for me. I was really focused on the idea of big pharma and the drug issues and the lies all the way back then. I mean, we're talking like a decade ago, and there's probably other aspects of it. Obviously, 9/11 is a huge story, but I think that's just kind of something that's always being covered and discussed almost year to year. But yeah, I think that all of that said, I mean, you could look at the website. There's just about every topic you can find. That foreign policy became such a focus for me just because of how obvious it is that the governments we're talking about, really specifically to say it in a very specific way, the governments that project themselves as fighting for freedom, the U.S. is only one of them, right? It's just so hard to come to terms with the reality that they're not just not doing that. They're literally seeding the world with all the things they pretend they need to stop, or allowing things in other circumstances that they pretend they don't want you to do. And it's such a hard, that's the whole cognitive dissonance moment, even more so than the other stuff, like just really going like, wow, okay. Like, every little thing. That's what I said before about like what isn't a lie, like realizing this and then going into the voting question. Like, it's like all these things that are just like foundational points. But I think the foreign policy thing was so clear to me because I harp on this every day. And this gets into the dark reality of like even just taking like the Israel-Palestine point, or even just the Middle East, realizing that the war on terror, which is just another extension of the war on drugs, the same kind of thing, it was really they are aiming at and fighting the very things, as I said before, that they have been flooding around the world. And as it's been framed over the years, is that they've been arming and funding the most radical elements of Islam, of really anything that they claim to fight. And this is a provable reality. Moderate rebels to any of the, I mean, and even just coming right back to the moment about Palestine and Gaza, and Haaretz posting this 2 days after October 7th, that Netanyahu publicly said that he arms Hamas. It's like, what? These things that just for the average person, just like that, just completely doesn't make any sense at all. And if you realize that they're the ones that are actually funding the radical elements they point to say we need to protect you from, and they realize that they do this to keep you scared and keep you quiet and keep you funding them, voting for them, giving them your taxes so they can keep funding the world with the bad things they pretend they're saving you from. It's this cycle that never goes away. And they murdered people based on these lies. They're doing it to Palestinians right now, right? And I think that is the hardest thing that I had to come to terms with, is like, it's not just one aspect of it. There may very well be, and I can promise you there are people in these elements that try to do the right thing, and I think it's most cases because they don't realize that they are incapable of doing that when they're in these positions, because of the system and how it controls, or maybe they just lie to themselves. But I think that it's a whole of system problem, a whole of government problem. And I think that's what's so hard for people to wrap their minds around. And then obviously from there, the work I've done since is pretty self-explanatory. It's just about anything that I think stands out, that I think is important, that it is contradicting a classically held belief. I mean, just anything. Like, we need to make sure we understand today. And more than ever, it's happening right now.
Yeah, just to point to what you just said there about obviously the reports about Netanyahu and Hamas. Obviously, you said arming them. It was obviously more kind of reported that he allowed Qatar and other countries to bolster Hamas up, and he allowed the money to kind of come in that they could split Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank to, not have a united state. And this is pretty public information, even pre-Netanyahu. You can read in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. Hamas was called Hamas. They built them up because they wanted to split them off from other more, not as radical groups. And it's obviously continued. You can hear Israeli politicians talk about Hamas being an asset and the Palestinian Authority being a liability, because no one's going to take Hamas serious on the center stage. So I thought I'd just add that there, to clarify for people that this is pretty public information.
Sorry, there's a delay. I'm just trying to find the moment, but I would disagree. The story that we're highlighting there is, I agree completely, but that is the sanitized, released version that, yes, has been published on Washington Post and New York Times. And when I'm not going to say because something comes out in these platforms that it means that it's false. That is a faulty premise that we use today. But when it comes out from these platforms that have been towing lines for decades, we need to ask why. Right? Why is this being dripped out at this point? And when I say that they're arming, like, first of all, you could look at it multiple ways. If you are making sure funding goes to the group that you're outwardly pretending you're fighting as a terrorist organization, and that's why bad Palestine, what do you think the money goes for? Right? I mean, you're giving them money. They're arming themselves with this money, or any group. So it's very clear that in that sense alone, you're arming this group. But even on top of that, I can show you lots of research that shows direct funding sources arming coming from weapons transfers and different things from groups that are being facilitated by Israel. And so it's a convoluted discussion. But I think the obvious reality is not to try to water it down with, that it was kind of like, well, we're trying, like, he said it very clearly, right? I'm not saying that to you. I'm saying that to, like, the general mainstream conversation. If you're sending your Mossad chief to Qatar, which is the point you were making about this overall, to try to basically push for more funding, it doesn't matter how you try to frame that. It's ultimately about maintaining the thing that you claim you're fighting. But then you can bring it even further into the reality of the actual organization itself, how it was actually turned into something that it is today, or rather more so in the middle, I would argue. Things have changed even more today by these elements. And I'm talking about the actual people that are, I mean, again, it's about realizing that they will fund Hamas. They pretend Hamas is the bad guy they're fighting, then use them to divide everything, then point to the PO and Fatah and the rest of them as the counterbalance on one side of it, then spin that into the terrorist organization on the other conversation. Right today, they're all terrorist organizations in the eyes of Israel. Fatah, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, like, it literally doesn't matter. If you are in any presence outside of just being a Gazan civilian, you're considered a terrorist, and quite frankly, even actually a civilian. So I think it's very obvious, going back to the war on terror point, that these groups have in fact chosen to make sure that these groups are powerful so that they can justify what they do. I mean, and that's exactly what happened with Hamas. So I think that's important to be very clear on it. But I agree with you. It's important that we're factual about this. The armed point often gets pushed back on, but I think that's something people need to come to terms with. I think it's a reality of what's happening, or was anyway.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with what you're saying there. If they're allowing the money going there, or as you said, they're sending the Mossad chief to Qatar to send more money, that money is for arms and all these other things. So I agree with you there. I just meant kind of, I guess, clarifying, because the on its own statement sounds more direct, and not saying that didn't happen as well, but just clarifying, I guess, the overall kind of story to people. But I mean, yeah, the Israel-Palestine one is obviously one of the things that kind of gets a lot of people into foreign policy. And as you said, I mean,
Good.
throughout the years, the US has funded, we funded the Mujahideen in the 80s, the UK, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, their intelligence agencies. That then becomes, the Taliban, Al Qaeda, obviously bin Laden, one of the financiers there. And then you go to somewhere, I don't know, South America, and then we're funding the most right-wing guerrillas there who will literally massacre people in the streets because they hated communism. We're always funding the worst of the worst.
Right.
And then, often, again, with Hamas or Al Qaeda, doesn't mean they have control over it because they funded it, can get out of hand. But then it creates a new, like ISIS comes from the Iraq War. That wasn't necessarily on purpose, but it's an outgrowth of it, which then means we need to stay here now to fight ISIS. That's the reason they say they're still in Syria, occupying Syria there. They're still in Iraq. And, they fund, either already terrorist groups or become terrorist groups. And then they say, well, then we need to fight these groups, which is going to create more terrorists. And it's just this cycle of just to basically keep the US military having just to be where they are, to do the other kind of objectives they have as well. But yeah, the funny thing is, obviously, when you talk to people like you or any kind of subject where you know quite a bit about it, you end up telling someone, it starts off, no, let me explain that. And then like an hour later, because you've gone, no, but to explain this, I need to explain that. But to explain that, and then it just keeps going to all these different subjects, foreign policy, the war on drugs, like the Iran-Contra scandal, stuff like that. You give them the whole bigger picture, which is why you kind of got to go on, obviously, your own journey. I know you've got to jump off soon. So is there any kind of final stuff you want to say about anything you see going on now, or kind of just on what we were discussing earlier about your personal journey, or anything people should be kind of looking out for at the moment with Israel and obviously Ukraine being in the headlines? What other stuff are we seeing? Well, just, take it how you want to.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that we could point out about what we should be on guard for. I'm worried about how the border conversation is going to be kind of turned into something, and I mean, there's obviously something to be concerned there, just in a general sense about whatever is driving what's going on. I tend to think there's overlaps to, outside, even a potential point about Israel being involved with what's happening there, and it's concerning. Now that's just theorizing about what's going on. I'm more worried about like the false flag element of the whole thing. But I mean, I'm worried about where we're going next with, where this election will go. I'm worried about the TikTok element that just passed today, in fact, and how they're now like literally in that bill allows them to completely remove websites. That's what's now been allowed, and how that actually gets used is we're going to see going forward. But with all the censorship, I don't see that being that far-fetched to see them start right from the root, just taking out websites and blocking things like that, which kind of expected, But yeah, I mean, in regard to just Palestine in particular, I'm worried about where this is going moment by moment. 25 plus children will starve to death in the north, and we have multiple examples. I mean, you've seen the story: 30,000 plus, 15,000 plus children, 70% women and children. Numbers confirmed now by the IDF from Gaza Health Ministry. Despite all the narratives shouting down about how we can't trust the numbers, the IDF has publicly said that they use those numbers in their own reports. And so is the UN, and so is the Lancet study proving they're correct. I can go off for 45 minutes about all the things they keep saying incessantly that I can prove prove as best you can prove anything that they're lying about it, and that they know they're lying about it. It's just a crazy dynamic, and it keeps going, and people keep getting killed, and they're blocking aid as a regular dynamic, and literally everybody, including the US now, are saying they're blocking aid. It's such a crazy thing. They're watching people starve to death, and they're going to build a port in the ocean. They tell us it will take a couple months. Like, these are the things that I'm worried about, what that actually means. I mean, this is more occupation, more military personnel in an area that nobody wants it in regard to the actual people in the territory, the Palestinians. So all this stuff worries me, but what I really hope people will do is, because there's so much awareness happening right now, people are questioning things they never have before, coming from the COVID illusion conversation, so many different things, is just continue to bolster that. Keep that flame alive. Question, I'm talking more than ever, in particular, people in the two-party illusion. Mainstream media is always known, and we all regard them in every angle to be dishonest. But we need to start paying attention to the left, right, speaking, talking heads of this. As David Icke lovingly recently called them, the mainstream alternative media, right? And it's meant to be an insult. These large people that are very clearly still trapped in the partisan dynamic that are provably. I can go back from the last few weeks and show how many things they've said that I can prove aren't true. And yet people still going along with it. Watch who you want, but keep that questioning alive and question these narratives that people are putting out, And thanks for having me on, brother. I really enjoy our conversations and hope to do it again.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'll let you go. Just one thing, how just from a crazy perspective, how silly is it that Israel's blocking this aid to come in, but now they've opened up so the US could bring in what they need to build the port to allow aid in a few months. It's just like, I saw a meme about it. I was like, I didn't think about that. That's crazy. But yeah, thanks for coming on. I know you got to jump off. Enjoy the conversation. I'll speak soon.
Thanks, brother. Have a good one.